The medical file arrived at Buckingham Palace yesterday evening at 6:41, hand-delivered by Charles's lead oncologist, who refused to discuss its contents with anyone except the king himself. What those 17 pages revealed has sent the palace into crisis mode and forced William to cancel all engagements through January, while raising questions about whether Great Britain would be witnessing two royal deaths within months of each other. What really could have been contained in the king's medical records? The report that changed everything. The palace's family doctor had requested a private audience with King Charles 3 days earlier, using language that immediately signaled severity to those within the palace. Not a routine follow-up, but a private audience to review some comprehensive assessment findings. Charles had been at Sandringham when the call came requesting his return to London. He had been spending more time at the Norfolk estate in recent weeks, finding comfort in the relative privacy and the routines that had sustained him through difficult periods. But the journey back to Buckingham Palace on December 10 carried such a weight he could not ignore. The meeting took place in Charles's private study, a room designed for confidential discussions with thick walls and security measures that ensured absolute privacy. Dr. Hartley had arrived with two colleagues, both specialists in advanced oncology. Charles had asked the Queen Consort, Camilla, to join him as he needed her strength for whatever was coming, and she sat beside him as the family doctor opened the leather folder containing the assessment. The first pages contained scanned images and technical data that meant little to Charles but clearly carried significance for the doctors. Specifically, page 3 contained the summary that changed everything. Charles had asked Dr. Hartley to repeat the timelines, as he needed to hear them again to confirm what he thought he had understood. Either way, he was looking at sometime between March and August of 2025 and probably would not see his next birthday in November. Camilla gripped his hand tightly, her face pale but composed in the way she had learned to be through decades of navigating crisis. She asked the question Charles was still processing. Is there any possibility the assessment is wrong? Any chance for better outcomes than these projections? The discussion that followed covered treatment options, though the possibilities were perhaps too generous a term for what remained available. The king could continue current protocols, accepting diminishing returns and increasing toxicity, buying maybe a few additional weeks or months of heavily compromised function, or he could transition to palliative care, focusing on maintaining quality of life for whatever time remained rather than pursuing aggressive intervention that was unlikely to meaningfully extend survival. King Charles asked about his capacity to continue royal duties under each scenario. This was the question that mattered institutionally, the one that would determine how the next months unfolded, not just for him personally but for the monarchy. The conversation extended nearly 2 hours, with Charles asking detailed questions about symptoms, timelines, and capabilities. When Dr. Hartley and his colleagues finally departed, leaving the comprehensive report for Charles to review at his own pace, the king sat in silence with Camilla for a long time. The winter evening had fallen dark outside as the study's lamps cast warm light that felt incongruous with the coldness Charles felt internally. He was 76 years old, had been king for less than 3 years, and was now being told his reign would be among the shortest in modern British history. The decisions Charles made that evening would determine how the monarchy navigated the most difficult transition it had faced in generations. He asked his private secretary to arrange an emergency meeting with William for the following morning. However, before retiring that night, Charles made one phone call that revealed where his mind had gone. He reached out to Harry in California, catching his younger son in the early afternoon. The conversation was brief as Charles's voice steadied while he told Harry that medical news had taken a serious turn and that if Harry wanted to see his father again, he should consider making arrangements to travel to the UK soon. As Charles prepared for bed that night, knowing sleep would be difficult, he thought about the irony of his situation. He had waited 73 years to become king, had spent his entire adult life preparing for a role that had seemed perpetually deferred. The king ascended the throne after his mother's death in September 2022 and had worked tirelessly to establish his reign as one of purpose and continuity. And now, barely 2 years later, he was facing the reality that his reign would be measured not in decades, but in months, that everything he had hoped to accomplish would remain unfinished. What the palace knew but never disclosed, the discrepancy between public statements about Charles's health and the medical reality he had been facing, stretched back 18 months to a period when the king's cancer diagnosis was still being characterized as treatable and manageable. The palace's first announcement in February 2024 had described a form of cancer discovered during a routine procedure, with treatment beginning immediately and prognosis described as favorable. What the public had not been told was that Charles's cancer had already metastasized by the time of diagnosis. The discovery during a prostate procedure had not been the identification of early-stage localized cancer, but rather the detection of disease that had spread beyond its original site. The favorable prognosis mentioned in Palace statements had been based on best-case scenarios rather than realistic assessments of what Charles was facing. From the beginning, his medical team had been managing an advanced cancer with uncertain outcomes, not the manageable condition the public believed he was treating. Throughout the spring and summer of 2024, Palace statements continued to strike notes of cautious optimism, making statements such as, "The king was responding well to treatment. He was maintaining his schedule with some modifications. He remained committed to his duties while prioritizing his health." Each statement had been technically accurate in narrow terms while obscuring the larger truth. The king was no doubt responding to treatment, but the response was partial and temporary. He was maintaining his schedule, but only through enormous effort and by hiding the extent of his fatigue and symptoms. He prioritized his health, but within the constraints of institutional demands that allowed little genuine recovery time. The decision to manage public communication this way had not been made lightly. Senior palace advisors, in consultation with Charles himself, had weighed the consequences of full disclosure against the needs of institutional stability. A monarch revealing he had advanced metastatic cancer with an uncertain prognosis would create immediate questions about succession and his capacity to rule. The palace had chosen to emphasize hope and continuity rather than acknowledge the precariousness of Charles's medical situation. But the strategy had created its own problems. How could they acknowledge deterioration without admitting they had been misleading the public about the severity from the beginning? The experimental treatments Charles had pursued, never mentioned in any public statement, reflected the desperation his medical team felt about conventional approaches. In June 2024, Charles had enrolled in a clinical trial for an immunotherapy designed to target his specific cancer type. The trial had required him to travel to a private facility in Switzerland, a journey explained to the public as a brief private retreat. The treatment had produced severe side effects and no measurable benefit, forcing Charles to withdraw from the trial after just 2 cycles. A second experimental approach in September had involved targeted radiation to specific metastatic sites combined with a novel drug therapy that had shown promise in animal studies but limited human data. By November, Charles's medical team had been discussing openly among themselves what they had been reluctant to tell the king directly. The decision to finally order a comprehensive reassessment had come from Charles himself in late November. He had recognized his declining energy, his increasing pain, and his sense that whatever treatments were being administered were not working. He had requested that Dr. Hartley assemble a complete picture by consulting whatever specialists were necessary and provide him with an unfiltered assessment of where he stood medically. That request had led to 2 weeks of intensive evaluation that produced the devastating report delivered yesterday. The palace's communication strategy had been built on a fundamental tension between constitutional necessity and medical reality. A monarch's health was not merely a personal concern but an institutional one. Charles's capacity to fulfill his role affected the entire governmental structure. His prognosis impacted succession planning, diplomatic relationships, and national stability. The palace had believed that managing this information carefully was necessary for all those reasons. But in doing so, they had created a situation where the eventual disclosure would be more shocking and destabilizing than honesty from the beginning might have been. Senior staff who had been privy to the full medical picture throughout the 18 months now faced their own reckoning. They had participated in a sustained effort to present Charles's health more optimistically than facts supported. Some had felt uncomfortable with this from the beginning, but had deferred to the judgment of those above them. Others had convinced themselves it was justified, that protecting institutional stability outweighed obligations of transparency. Now, with Charles's death potentially weeks away, those rationalizations felt increasingly hollow. The comparison to Queen Elizabeth's final years was inevitable. She had also faced declining health, managed through careful public relations, with the palace never fully acknowledging how frail she had become until after her death. But Elizabeth had been 96, had reigned for 7 decades, and her decline had felt natural, even if its extent was hidden. Charles was 76, had reigned for 2 years, and the revelation that he had been dying throughout most of that reign would raise questions about honesty and transparency that the palace would struggle to answer satisfactorily. What palace insiders understood, even as they grappled with the ethical complexity of their approach, was that Charles himself had been complicit in the managed optimism. He had wanted to continue functioning as king for as long as possible. He had resisted acknowledging the full severity of his condition because acknowledgement would require stepping back from duties he had waited his entire life to assume. The palace had not deceived him, had not hidden information from their king. They had implemented a communication strategy Charles himself had approved, believing it served the greater good, even at the cost of transparency. Now, with medical reality forcing decisions that could no longer be deferred, the palace faced the challenge of transitioning from managed optimism to managed acknowledgement of terminal illness. The public would need to be told, William would need to be prepared for imminent succession, and the institution would need to begin the difficult work of explaining why they had spent 18 months suggesting Charles was fighting cancer successfully when in fact he had been losing that fight almost from the beginning. William's emergency ascension preparations. The call reached Prince William at Adelaide Cottage at 7:15 on the morning of December 11, less than 12 hours after Charles had received the devastating medical report. William had been awake already, sitting at Catherine's bedside as she slept fitfully. His father's private secretary calling at this hour meant only one thing: the situation with Charles had deteriorated,